Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Kevin Watkins. I'm director here at ODI. I'd like to welcome you all. I'm really delighted that we're holding this event on urban sanitation markets, scale and resilience, and the role of the private sector in addressing some of the big challenges in sustainability. And since I probably know less about sanitation than anybody in this room, I'm going to take the opportunity just to give a few very initial remarks, if I may, on what I think are some of the big challenges and the connections to wider development issues. And it strikes me there are a bunch of things that we know, and I've got 6 here, and a bunch of things that we need to address really urgently as a community that works on these issues. The first thing we know, and in case we didn't already know it from before 2000, we certainly know it now, is that rapid economic growth, strong economic growth, rising average incomes, and even poverty reduction actually produce very weak effects in sanitation. Far weaker, I would argue, than almost any other area of development. You know, there's a variable but strong relationship between growth and poverty reduction, a strong relationship between growth and access to water, a strong relationship between growth and many child health indicators and education. But in sanitation, it's an incredibly weak relationship. And I think it's no coincidence that we ended the Millennium Development Goals further off track in sanitation than any other goal. Around 2.7 or 2.5 billion people still lacking access to improved sanitation. So I think the first lesson is that growth and markets don't deliver this particular public good automatically. And I know that may be a statement of the blindingly obvious, but I think it has very far-reaching implications for what we're discussing today. The second thing I think we know is that even when sanitation expands with growth, it does so incredibly unequally. And whereas in many other areas of the Millennium Development Goals, and I include most of the ones I mentioned just now, we've actually seen inequality shrinking, albeit from very high levels, and albeit that there are still very steep social gradients in place. But in the case of sanitation, we've actually seen what were already big inequalities widening in many countries, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia. And I would say if there's one country that brings together those two themes of a very weak growth effect and a large inequality effect, it's India. You know, one of the fastest growing countries in the world. It's pretty much doubled average incomes since 2000, actually more than doubled average income since 2000, with no discernible effect on overall access to energy, but with widening disparities. So that's the second thing I think we know. The equity effects on sanitation are incredibly weak. The third thing I think we know, and this is again to state the blindingly obvious, but I think it has really important development implications, is that the expansion of access to sanitation is moving much more slowly than the expansion of access to water. And I know, again, I'm telling you the blindingly obvious here, but I do think this has enormous and largely unrecognized ramifications for development. In my various jobs over the years, I've interacted a lot with economists, and I'm not an economist by background, I'm a historian. And I think one of the arguably few useful things, actually I wouldn't say that, one of the many useful things that historians can bring to perspective in these debates is that if you look at the great breakthroughs in human development in history, going back to the 19th century in Europe and the earliest 20th century in the United States, that one of the big catalyst moments, if I could put it very crudely, is when the technologies developed that separated shit from water. And there's a misperception, I think, on the part of many people that the big breakthrough happened earlier with the expanded access to clean water in European cities. But in fact, if you look at indicators like infant mortality, child mortality, public health, it was actually the great sanitation changes, which admittedly coincided with immunization. So, you know, there's an overlap. But that separation of crap from water was a great development leap forward in human history. Now, what we're seeing in many developing countries now is what we had in 19th century Europe, which is rapid urbanization, but without this separation of human excrement from water. And as you see automatically when you go to any city, when we did the Human Development Report many years ago, I spent quite a bit of time in slums in Kenya, in Nairobi. And the feature of those systems is that you get people tapping into the water supply system with very low quality pipes, which burst, and throwing excrement into public places. And you put those two things together, and I think you understand why you have such high rates of child illness in those contexts. And of course, actually, Kibera is a classic example of the inequity as well, because it borders on one of the richest urban areas in Kenya, actually where President Arap Moi lives. And the sewage pipes from those houses pass under Kibera, but of course nobody in Kibera has access to publicly financed, publicly supported sanitation. So that's the third thing we know. I think that we're facing, I believe, a very real human development risk as with population growth, rising concentrations of people, urbanization, and more people having access to clean water but not having access to sanitation. This is a perfect storm for major development setbacks looking ahead. The fourth thing I think we know is that many of the barriers that have to be removed are not economic, but they're behavioral, or they're behavioral as well as economic. You know, even when we see subsidized latrines of various types provided into the market, people who potentially could afford them choose not to purchase them. And, you know, and I don't know if any of you ever look at the Copenhagen Consensus website, but it's a classic example of economists not understanding the real world, because they constantly hold up the high rates of return, you know, ostensibly $17 for every $1 you invest, which begs the very obvious question, are people too stupid to understand the rate of returns? Do they lack the insights of the various Harvard-trained economists that the Copenhagen Consensus is able to bring together? Or is there something else going on that prevents people accessing these potentially affordable technologies? So I think there is a growing recognition, which is reflected actually in the last World Development Report, that behavioral stuff matters in markets. But I think this is a particular market where we need to understand much more about behavioral barriers. We also know, and this is the final point, the sixth point, that rapid scale up is possible, that despite the very bleak global numbers, there are many examples, extraordinary examples actually at a subnational level and even at a national level in some countries of rapid progress occurring. Brazil is one, where it's happened through municipal scale interventions. Pakistan is another, where it has happened through local government intervention, but with strong support from central government. And actually, in some ways, the most surprising is Nepal, which you couldn't argue is national scale, but I can't remember the name of the initiative now. But whatever the major sanitation initiative is in Nepal, this idea of creating open defecation-free zones has clearly achieved some traction and is delivering results on the ground. So scale up is possible. Now, I think that brings us to one of the big themes in the discussion today, which is about the role of the private sector and markets. And I think the starting point that everybody acknowledges is that there's an enormous public good available here if we can get it right. I do think it's right that improved sanitation delivers very high returns, measured in terms of social development opportunities for poor households, sickness episodes avoided, more time spent in school, breaking the link, which is, I think, one of the greatest barriers to development around the world now between malnutrition, between poor sanitation, malnutrition, child mortality, and wider disadvantages. So there's a big public goods opportunity here. But the question of how we how we unlock it, I think is what you're discussing today, which is, what is the role of the market? What are the appropriate types of finance? And what are the delivery mechanisms that work? And I think there's a broad understanding that certainly in the world's poorest countries, that the types of investment that led to the 19th century breakthroughs in Europe are not an option for many countries, in particular countries with large fiscal deficits. Most of those breakthroughs in Europe were financed by public debt. Actually, sanitation was the biggest single cause of public debt, I think, behind financing wars at the end of the 19th and the turn of the 20th century. Now, that is not an option for most low-income countries. I think this is not something that bond markets, by and large, are going to finance on that sort of scale, which may rule out the great public infrastructure works type of approach. And so then I think the question is, what are the types of approaches that will facilitate and support action at the community level? What are the types of private and public mix? How do you create a financing framework for sanitation that doesn't have the effect of transferring all of the risk to governments and to taxpayers and all of the profit to private sector operators, but generates a balanced set of returns on both sides? And I think here, if I may, there's a really interesting analogy to be drawn with electricity, because there is clearly, this is a public good, but it's also a public good with very high private returns. And the fact that something is a public good doesn't automatically mean it should be 100% publicly financed. It might mean that, but I think it probably doesn't mean that in this case. And if you think of the number I gave you initially of the 2.5 billion people lacking access to sanitation, that's a much bigger number than the people who live in poverty. So, many of the people we're talking about are probably on incomes of between $3 a day and $10 a day. Now, one of the things I've been working on in a different context is off-grid energy supply in Africa. And the interesting thing there is that people are already paying much more for energy than they would have to pay if they were linked to a renewable product like a solar panel or something like that. They have to buy charcoal, they have to buy torches, they spend time collecting firewood. So there's a clear economic return to the household if they can make the upfront investment. They can drive down the recurrent cost of energy. That doesn't actually apply in such an obvious way to sanitation. And so I think the question is, how do you incentivize people to get into the market? How do you subsidize, where necessary, the upfront costs? And how do you generate the research and the development and the investment that will lead to the private sector generating the sort of products for which there will actually be a demand? So I think these are some of the issues that you guys are going to be discussing over the course of the day. I just wanted to conclude before I hand over to Nat by saying something about the agenda. So, Nat, you're going to do you're going to do the leading presentation right now. There's then a panel which will be facilitated by Tim Brewer from WaterAid, and then a set of sessions looking at sanitation at scale, opportunities and barriers for engaging with market actors, and sanitation market analysis and strengthening. So it's an incredibly full agenda, and there's an extraordinary group of people to bring together. So I think it's going to be a really productive day. And I apologise in advance that I can't be here for most of it, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing the outcomes. Great. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Kevin. Fascinating perspectives, and great to have a view from outside the sector, as I imagine most of us would consider ourselves WASH or perhaps sanitation specialists. I'm assuming, though, that the audience is mainly those who are interested in using markets to deliver pro-poor sanitation goods and services, rather than people involved in the dirty business of sanitation entrepreneurship. If you are a sanitation entrepreneur, we need to hear from you. I've got the relatively easy task today of throwing some ideas out there as food for thought, and then handing over to people who know the details far better than me. And this is more of a personal reflection building on some ODI research rather than a presentation of a single ODI research project. I've been asked to offer some definitions, or at least some food for thought about what we mean by the various terms that feature in the title today, so market, scale and resilience. These come from the Markets and WASH learning event that was held in Nairobi in October, and I think they're helpful. The first of them, the point I'd like to highlight is very simple, just that markets aren't just the physical places where goods and services are exchanged. It's blindingly obvious. And obviously the physical places are necessary, but they're not sufficient. I think the second point is probably more interesting, that we can consider a market system, a sort of network of actors, individuals, organisations that relate to each other, and they do so through various rules of the game. And those rules of the game can be formal or they can be informal. So formal rules in the game might include specific regulatory standards for things like latrine pit slabs. Informal rules might include sludge tanker operators in an urban slum monopolising a service through cartel tactics. Prices, I think, are quite an interesting category here. They're obviously intrinsic set of rules for any market, but for a lot of pro-poor sanitation markets, they lie somewhere in between. So they're kind of understood and agreed by the various actors and organisations, but they're not necessarily formalised or regulated in any way. In terms of scale, I want to draw here on some research that we've just been doing for UNICEF and the UN Foundation on WASH and the private sector in general, that I've done with my colleague Mariana, who's sitting over there, and another colleague, William Smith, formerly in the private sector and markets team. Thinking about what the markers of markets that work at scale might be, the first thing to highlight, I think, is horizontal integration across these links in the value chain. So a value chain is made up of different components, each is a sort of functionally distinct area that adds value to the product or service overall, a marginal increase in that value. And the second is integration across scales of business, so from sole traders right the way up to multinationals. The question I'd like to ask is, can we achieve scale if we neglect a link in that value chain? So thinking about small sanitation enterprises, how many of those have the capability to engage effectively in marketing or in the more technically complex areas like treatment and resource recovery? And secondly, thinking about vertical integration and the whole system, can we achieve scale with relying solely on small-scale service providers, or indeed on large-scale service providers? And that brings us back rather to the idea of this network and the possibility that although those two dimensions are presented as a sort of linear matrix, the relationships do exist more as a network. Businesses at different scale engaging in different parts of the value chain. What ingredients do we need to highlight in terms of achieving sanitation at scale? I just want to highlight three briefly. Kevin's alluded to these already. The first is finance, not just how much finance, but I think importantly what kind of finance. Because as a business grows, it's going to need access to different kinds of finance. So a small sanitation enterprise with a bright idea is going to need seed capital of some kind, largely grant finance. As it grows, it might transition to concessional loans and ultimately to commercial finance. And that raises this really interesting and difficult question we have in WASH of how to use public finance to crowd in private and commercial finance rather than displacing it. The second is expertise. That's support on the stuff that small and poor, or businesses run by poor people, struggle with, not for lack of skills, but because they're too busy with the basic day-to-day business of running their business, right? So things like marketing or research and development to develop new and innovative products, desirable and affordable products for low-income households. And thirdly, this catch-all, slightly lazy catch-all of public policy. But the question I think we need to ask ourselves is how much of what government, of civil society, of NGOs, of donors are doing is actually helping businesses to serve poor people. So are poorly targeted subsidies displacing a market opportunity for sanitation businesses? What's the average cost or time to register a small-scale sanitation business? Are pit emptying providers being incentivised to take fecal waste to wastewater treatment plants or to dump it in the river? On to resilience, and this is where I have to say I'm on shakier ground. Shocks tend to dominate our conceptual definitions of resilience, and shocks are sexy, but I think that stresses are also important. They matter too. So fluctuations in household incomes that threaten a microfinance institution's cost recovery model, for example, or increasing import tariffs on raw materials that slowly drive a small-scale slab manufacturer out of business. One plus of resilience is that it's bandied around a lot and used a lot in two domains that get the kind of political attention that sanitation specialists dream about, which are climate change and humanitarian crises. So I think it's a useful term, but it's one that has its own set of baggage, and we need to be wary about importing that baggage if we're going to use it in the context of sanitation. Jonathan Parkinson, who's sitting here, was brave and kind enough to offer me a definition which I put up here, and I think it's a good one and a useful one, and it reflects particularly the ideas of markets being both present in and, if you like, a bridge to support and recovery from crises. We'll hear much more about that in the last session of the day, which I think is going to be a really interesting one. Being less brave, I'm going to point to three features that I think are ingredients to resilient markets. The first is foresight. I'm not talking there about a crystal ball, but consideration of the kind of reasonably likely events and how you might proof your sanitation market against those. So, for example, the need for flood-resistant sanitation products and services in delta cities or low-income informal settlements on floodplains. The second is agility, the ability to change business strategies, to tweak the product offering, to innovate. For example, as Kevin was alluding to, where customers in low-income settlements start to get access to water supply and the feasibility and desire for poor flush or flush options becomes preferred. And thirdly, safety nets. And what I mean there is kind of the wiggle room, if you like, that will allow a business or help a business avoid going to the wall in times of crisis. So at the individual firm level, that might be access to accessible credit. But at the system level, it might be the diversity of different products and services on offer. So what's the so what here? What are the implications for those of us that are looking to support sanitation markets that work maybe in the public sector or in NGOs or in the larger private sector? I've got some suggestions, and it's by no means a comprehensive list. I illustrate it with a help from three very simple but hopefully venerable stories, with the aim that might be a bit more memorable than another policy checklist. So the first I'll borrow from Goldilocks. So for Goldilocks, in sampling each of the chairs and the porridge and the beds in the house of the three bears in the forest, there was one of each that was just right. And I think it's important to ask ourselves, is there a level of public support for sanitation and sanitation markets in particular that can be just right? So too little can undermine markets before they get going. In Indonesia, the development of decentralized wastewater systems is getting a lot of public subsidies, particularly for low-income communities. But then the communities are largely left themselves to manage what are quite technically complex systems. This is a sort of Sanimas program, it's generally called. And in the absence of stimulation and support, markets just aren't really springing up to serve those communities with things like technical and capital maintenance support. And on the other hand, too much support can also keep the kind of promising business models trapped in this limbo, if you like, between market-oriented NGO that generates some of its revenue from a commercial service, but relies still on grant finance, and transitioning to a fully commercial business. That's fine, I think, if subsidies enable a service and are well targeted to enable a service to the poorest, but quite often anything with a private sector badge is attracting public or donor finance just because it has that private sector badge, and that's a hot topic right now. The photo, by the way, shows Fresh Life toilets in Kenya, and I don't think that's necessarily an example of a sanitation enterprise that is suffering from too much public support, but it is an issue that I've discussed with a number of people involved in sanitation enterprises, and they say it's a live issue for them, whether the business energy and those involved in the business is going to winning grants or making the business more efficient and commercially viable. The second issue to highlight is aim, and I'll use William Tell here. So he had this famously unerring eye and was able to shoot the apple off his son's head. And in attempting to support sanitation markets, it's going to be important to think about which part of the value chain and which types of business we should aim to support in order to serve low-income groups. From working with manual pit emptying operators like these gentlemen operating a Golpa in Kibera, to supporting latrine artisans to better tailor and market actually their product offerings. So the second thing we need is decent targeting. And this is where proper market analysis comes in, and we've got a session on that which is great later on in the afternoon. And thirdly and finally, for those of us looking to back winners in sanitation markets, is the tortoise a better model than the hare? Another widely held belief, I think, in the public sector about the private sector is that private sector development happens much quicker. So a promising sanitation business model is expected to achieve citywide scale-up in a matter of months rather than years. But if you look out over a city of the complexity of, well, this one's Kano or Kampala, or any of the thousands of villages that are going to turn into towns, or towns that are going to turn into cities over the next few decades, it's clear that while change happens very rapidly, and much of that change is happening in the market, tilting markets to serve development interests is going to be a much longer-term project. So I'll wrap up there, and I think we'll need a moment to reorganise to hand over to the next panel. But Kevin, I wonder if you want to ask any or invite any questions from the audience, or
Well, I think that would be good, actually, not necessarily to me, but to you, and or if there's any issues that people want to raise at this stage,
or
I
clarifications.
think that would be, or clarifications, would be a good idea. So just throw it open before we go into the panels. Maybe you could just say who you are as well. Thanks.
I'm Hugh Wemman-Smith. I was an Odin in Zambia long ago. One of the issues that comes up here, which makes it a bit different from other areas where this kind of question is explored, is where exactly are the potential income streams? And I haven't actually got an answer to that, but it's a question which I think should sort of come up in many of the sessions, and if some good answers emerge, that will be nice.
Thanks. Good point. Other thoughts? So you run right from, maybe you run down.
Thank you. Jonathan Parkinson from Oxfam. Just an observation. I think very relevant, very pertinent was the issue that you raised, Nat, in relation to the role of NGOs and private sector, and effectively the tension that exists for organisations to be seeking essentially grant funding from donors in relation to sort of switching over to a private sector commercial role and the different financing mechanisms to support those activities. And I think I see that playing out at all levels, whether it's a local NGO in Bangladesh, which is effectively acting as a commercial entity in some respects, but also seeking grant funding. And I think that's a really fundamental kind of issue that we need to explore a bit more. Thank you.
Thanks. Good point. Any other initial comments? No? No, do you want to respond?
Maybe just to the first point, I think, maybe that links to this issue of targeting or aim, and identifying those areas that are going to generate different kinds of income streams is, I think you're absolutely right to highlight it. One of the areas that I think has been overlooked or on the edges or periphery of our kind of sanitation consciousness is obviously fecal sludge management as a system, and the fact that the MDGs had this very clear focus on the containment part, but then all the rest of the chain was largely neglected. I'm grateful that it is an issue that's come onto the radar, and there's some great research that's being done by people in the room on that topic. So hopefully we can hear from them either in comments or in conversation later. But yeah, absolutely right to highlight it, and hopefully we'll have more examples coming out later.
Great. Okay. I mean, I guess one big issue in this is an obvious one of how do you not so much generate the supply, but create the demand. And I have to say, just travelling around Africa, one probably sees more, especially in rural Africa, actually, more standalone latrines that don't work anymore because they were grant funded by an NGO with not necessarily with the demand in place for the particular product. So I think the demand creation does seem to be a really important part of this. Okay, so thank you everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks very much, Kevin.
Cheers.